In 2021, in preparation for my ordination, I translated the 1689 London Baptist Confession into modern English. My extensive work on false friends in the King James Version prepared me well for this work. And soon, sure enough, I began to discover not only dead words in the confession, but false friends. For the purposes of this particular video, I will treat the London and Westminster Confessions and the Savoy Declaration as one, calling all three simply the Confession, since their content overlaps at every point that's relevant to this false friends discussion. A false friend, for those who don't know, is three things. It's a word in an older English document, or it could be a piece of punctuation in a document, or any feature of language, though we'll stick with words. It's a word that we still use today. Second, it's a word that we use with a different set of senses than were used in the time of that older document, such as Shakespeare or the King James Version or the Confession. And third, it's a word in which the modern sense that contemporary readers are most likely to assume still makes enough sense in context that these readers are likely to be misled in that place without knowing it, due to no fault in the framers of the confession or in the contemporary reader, but solely due to the inevitable process of language change. False friends are a significant problem for contemporary readers of any old document. C.S. Lewis called them dangerous senses. Both Ben Franklin in the 18th century and Noah Webster in the 19th noticed them occurring in the King James. So did the RSV translators, for what it's worth, and they all complained about it. They complained because false friends are especially problematic for those documents, like the Bible and the Confessions, which are supposed to be read and used and memorized and cited by non-specialists, even children. Roman Catholicism has no doctrine of the priesthood of the believer, and its church services are not centered on the Word, but on the Eucharist. It, therefore, feels far less need to make sure that its documents are perspicuous, that is, clear, accessible to the laity. But Protestantism has always been a kingdom of priests. The default Protestant is the plowboy. Our Bible translations and our confessions have to undergo regular revision, or the plowboy will get bogged down by Protestant traditions that were originally begun to provide him, in the words of the King James translators, a pannery of wholesome food against fennoed traditions. So there are dead words in the confession, obsolete lexemes that even scholars may not know, words akin to pannery, P-A-N-A-R-Y, which meant bakery, and fennoed, F-E-N-O-W-E-D, which meant moldy. And dead words are a problem. The confession itself warns people not to destroy their own profession by any errors everting the foundation. But you don't know the word everting. You don't use that word. No one does. It's dead. It cannot edify because it's meaningless. The dictionary can help, of course, and it actually says that the word evert still exists in contemporary English, though with a different sense than the one used here. But this is a zombie word. If it's alive, it's kept on life support by dictionaries. I'm firmly pro-life, but I think it's time to pull the plug on everting. I've never heard or read this word in my entire life, and I've read a fair amount of English. Evert is dead. I looked it up in a linguistic corpus, and it appeared very few times, most of them typos for the word every or the word ever. It would be much better to say errors undermining the foundation. When I translated the confession as I prepared for my own ordination at Cornerstone Baptist Church of Anacortes, Washington, ordination to the pastoral ministry, I replaced dead words with modern equivalents, and I split up countless sentences into shorter ones. Someone can always say, we should raise people up to the level of the confession, not dumb the confession down to their level. And I sympathize. Why teach a confession or anything at all if we're not trying to raise people's level of understanding? But as I worked on my own confession translation, I kept particular people in my local assembly in my mind. Will John and Jane be able to process this sentence? Can they be discipled and instructed and formed by it? That was my continual question as I worked through this impressive and wonderful teaching document. And I came to believe that I was not dumbing down the Westminster Confession or the London Baptist Confession. I was translating it into modern forms. You can judge our current forms in English to be inferior if you wish, but somehow I doubt that your own speech, even in preaching if you're a preacher, uses anywhere near the number of dead words as the confession does, or has anywhere near the complexity and ellipticality and length of so many of the confession's sentences. I find the language of the confession beautiful, I do, but I sure hope the sermons at your church don't sound like it, because at many points, the hearers simply will not understand. But dead words and long sentences are not my concern in this video, for which the intro has been way too long. These are, in my opinion, surmountable obstacles for the educated and motivated. When you encounter a dead word, you know you have to look it up, right? When you encounter a long sentence, you can use various tools that hopefully you've been taught. You can look for the subject and verb and work from there. But when you encounter a false friend, you may not even realize that you're misunderstanding. You might be positively misled. False friends trip plowboys. I want to talk quickly through just 5 examples of false friends in the confession. Then, at the end, I'd like to offer some indulgently long reflections on the situation that we're in with the confession. Hop in your carriage and ride along with me. This will be exciting for a certain kind of person. Number 1, first false friend, circumstances. This is the first I'll mention in the list of 5. This is one that shows up in a key line, one of those lines that still gets quoted regularly because it's relevant to ongoing debates, I think interminable debates over the regulative principle. I never realized that I didn't understand it myself until I had to translate it. What do you think circumstances means in this context? Listen. There are some circumstances concerning the worship of God and government of the church, common to human actions and societies, which are to be ordered by the light of nature and Christian prudence, according to the general rules of the word, which are always to be observed. My contemporary dictionary tells me that this word circumstances means a fact or condition connected with or relevant to an event or action. It gives this sample sentence: we wanted to marry, but circumstances didn't permit. But that's not what the Westminster divines meant when they used this word. They meant that which is non-essential, accessory, or subordinate, a detail, a particular. They meant subordinate matters or details, strictly matters appendant or relative to a fact. That comes from the great lexicographer Johnson, viewed as extraneous to its essence, but passing into the sense of subordinate parts of the fact, details. The Oxford English Dictionary lexicographers say that this sense of the word is obsolete. You can squint your eyes, cock your head, and choose to see no real difference between the sense that I'm saying most people hear and the one that the OED editors say is obsolete. But I think you're wrong. Open up those eyes, let thine eyelids look straight before thee. You will see that the modern sense of this word circumstance, which is a relatively common word, makes the circumstances of the confession relevant to the worship of God and the government of the church and of society, while the framers of the confession meant the opposite. They meant matters irrelevant, non-essential, extraneous. More likely, I think circumstances just kind of means nothing to modern readers in a context like this one in the confession. When I translated it, I wrote, there are some extraneous details concerning the worship of God and the rule of the church, etc. False friend number 2 from the confession, necessities. The confession says, saints by profession are bound to maintain a holy fellowship and communion in the worship of God, and in performing such other spiritual services as tend to their mutual edification, as also in relieving each other in outward things, according to their several abilities and necessities. If you're paying close attention, you might notice that this word necessities doesn't quite seem to work, at least according to the way we use it today. The word here creates what I have called on this channel long ago when I used to talk about such things, a contextual conflict. Why should the things I need be relevant to whether or not I give someone else what he needs? I'm giving according to my ability and my necessity. Or maybe is this saying that I don't have to give to others if I have needs myself? And no matter how you interpret this, I just can't hear a contemporary English speaker using this word necessities in this slot. If I were editing a contemporary text that used this word here, I'd replace it. We've got the bare necessities, the simple bare necessities of life, but it sounds funny here. Necessities are nearly always things we need to live: food, water, shelter. Some contemporary dictionaries, not all, do mention a sense of necessity that fits here. It's poverty, the quality or state of being in need. But that works in the singular and not in the plural. What are poverties? You ought to be careful when interpreting Older English to listen to the little pedant in the back of your head when he or she says, "That sounds funny." And don't be satisfied to find a related meaning like needs, as if this phrase meant that we should relieve each other according to our individual abilities and needs. That works, but I think it's not quite what was intended here by the writers. And I know this because I checked the Oxford English Dictionary, the massive, expensive, 20-volume, grandmother, grandfather, and great-grandee once removed of all dictionaries. This, the OED, is the only dictionary that records the entire history of the English language. And the Oxford English Dictionary has a sense of necessities in the plural, which I would say works rather well here in the confession. Here it is. A specific situation of hardship or difficulty, a pressing need or want, frequently in plural. Then the OED makes a little comment. This sense for necessities is now rare. In my translation, I wrote that believers must also relieve each other in outward things according to their various abilities and their various needs and difficulties. I used two words for the confession's one, acknowledging that the point here is that yes, you have to acknowledge whether you have your own needs. For example, I have a friend who's starting up a podcast again and he's looking for a GoFundMe. This is not a time when I've chosen to do that kind of charitable giving. I myself am trying to launch a new venture. I'm maintaining my support of people that I've promised to support, but I'm not introducing anybody new to my support list because of my own necessities. The third of our 5 false friends, and there are more, but I'm stopping at 5, is authentic. The confession says that the scriptures have been kept pure in all ages and are therefore authentic. So as in all controversies of religion, the church is finally to appeal to them. To us, this word authentic, means that the scriptures are of undisputed origin, genuine. They've been kept pure, so they match the originals. They're genuine. And there is a sense in the OED, of course, that matches our contemporary use and fits this context rather well. The OED, of course, gives contemporary senses of words and not just older senses. Here's that sense, especially of a document that is the origin or source of something, original, primary, not a copy. But I don't think the Westminster divines could have meant this. They knew we didn't have the originals. And in fact, that's not what authentic meant in a context like that one in the 1640s when the Westminster Confession was first written. The OED shows that this is what the word authentic meant. That possesses authority, entitled to obedience or respect, authoritative of a thing, now rare. Now, it does make sense to say that the Hebrew Old Testament and Greek New Testament have been kept pure in all ages and are therefore genuine, and therefore ought to be the final court of appeal in Christian controversies. But it makes even better sense, and the right sense, to say that the Hebrew Bible and Greek New Testament have been kept pure and are therefore authoritative, and therefore the final court of appeal in religious controversies in the Christian church. In my translation of this paragraph, I wrote, the Old Testament in Hebrew, which was the native language of the Israelite people of God, and the New Testament in Greek, which at the time of its writing was the lingua franca of the nations, are what can properly be called inspired by God. By his remarkable care and providence, these scriptures have been kept pure in all ages, and they are therefore authoritative. In all controversies of religion, the church's final appeal must be to the inspired Hebrew and Greek. I found a modern translation of the confession somewhere online that did not catch this one. It got tripped up by this false friend in my estimation. It left the word authentic, didn't use the word authoritative. But I'm confident I'm right. And the modern English translation of the confession that is at founders.org did catch this one. Number 4, spirits. In that same chapter 1 of the confession, just 2 paragraphs after the previous example, we read this. The supreme judge by which all controversies of religion are to be determined, and all decrees of councils, opinions of ancient writers, doctrines of men, and private spirits are to be examined, and in whose sentence we are to rest, can be no other but the Holy Spirit speaking in the Scripture. What are private spirits? Sounds like what the Witch of Endor did, maybe, calling up a dead Samuel? Or is this some obscure reference to sign gifts? People who had the gift of spiritual insight or something? No, the Oxford English Dictionary shows that private spirits meant reflective or perceptive faculties, mental powers, senses, wits. This sense is obsolete. Now, this is a tough one. There's another OED sense that is appealing, one that in early use meant imaginations. And when a long time ago I used to look at King James false friends, I had another point in the triangle that I could check to help me discern which English sense was in the mind of the King James translators. That point was the original Hebrew or Greek. I could look at the meaning of that word, but I can't do that here with a confession because it was originally written in English. So I'm not totally sure which sense to go with. But in my translation, I went for private ideas. The Founders.org translation went for private interpretations. That's appealing too. Fifth and finally, the confession reads, "From this original corruption whereby we are utterly indisposed, disabled, and made opposite to all good, and wholly inclined to all evil, do proceed all actual transgressions." Today, this phrase, opposite to all good, most naturally means that we are made into evil. We're made the opposite of good. But I think the Westminster Divines meant that original sin makes us opposed to all good. And that's how I translated it in my own translation of the confession. I like how the Founders.org translation has it. We are thoroughly biased against and disabled and antagonistic toward all that is good. That gets it. Now, I think scandalize, propriety, conversation, constantly, communicate, discovery, and reasonable, and more words in the confession are also false friends in at least some places in the confession. But again, I'm stopping at 5 for this video. Permit me now to reflect on what the existence of false friends in a confessional document means. Let me suggest a few so whats for you. Alan Jacobs, in his fascinating little history of the Book of Common Prayer, explains that the need for a revision of the 1662 text of the BCP was evident for a long time, but it took World War I to make it happen. Why? Well, before then, no party in the church was willing to risk a revision because they didn't trust the other parties to revise only the English and not the substance of the prayer book. The BCP functions somewhat like confessional language in a very divided Anglican church. But as young Englishmen died by the thousands in French trenches, the call came back from chaplains that they needed to be able to give these boys words they could understand. It became clear that another force had been revising the BCP under everyone's noses: language change. There simply is no way to write a document that will be understood as readily by future generations as it may be by one's own. The pull of tradition is very strong, even among self-confessedly anti-traditionalist independents. The Westminster and London Baptist Confessions exist in the middle of smaller power struggles than did the Book of Common Prayer in the past. There is simply a narrower range of opinion over what the confession, and again I'm treating Westminster and London as one here, what it means, and that's a good thing. It means that representative bodies of confessionalists who hew to Westminster should be able to come together to translate the confession into modern English. And I do mean translate, not update. Obviously, most of the confession is still intelligible to contemporary English speakers, but in those places where it isn't, whether people know it or not, it isn't because the confession is too hard, written by smart people for other smart people. It's because it uses a different English than the one we use. I believe that early modern English can usefully be regarded as a separate language, different from our own, despite the great and undeniable overlap between the two Englishes. You almost have to conceive of that English, the confession's English, as being its own system in order to step outside of your own and into it. Also, update sounds like you're changing things. People won't like that. Translate doesn't have that ring to it. So I'm urging my brothers out there in the Reformed worlds that use the confession to translate the Westminster and/or London Baptist confessions. Much preliminary work has been done. Several others have done this work. But I think a set of recognized experts who, are widely regarded as representing confessionalist institutions of various sorts, that is denominations and schools most likely, maybe publishing houses as well, they could do an even better job. Men who've written commentaries on the confession could get together with, say, a red-headed word nerd who has gained some experience in noticing divergences between contemporary and early modern Englishes. We could come up with an official, minimal translation of the confession and catechism. I've had the shorter catechism in my desk drawer for years and years now. I use it. Something that could achieve wide adoption. I have a well-placed friend in the conservative confessionalist world who is working on just such a thing. I may have him here on the channel to talk about it if he's willing. The question will arise, of course, is now the time for this work? One of the great values of the confession, and I want people to hear me say this, is that it has not changed in a long time. And I get that 100%. I respect those brothers who believe that the value of keeping the language and therefore most definitely connecting yourself to that tradition is greater than the burden of explaining the confession. The thing is, however, that in my experience, the people who make this argument don't then get around to explaining the language of the confession. People proceed with their various unwitting confusions. The confession is meant to be a teaching document, and my work on false friends over the years has shown that some of the words have shifted meaning in such a way that many or most people won't even realize that they're misunderstanding. Again, I might have said this on this channel before. These are what I call false friends. And think of the people in your church, no matter what your confession is. How many of them can make it through the, what are to us now, tortuously long sentences of the Westminster Confession? Among those who do, even they will be tripped up sometimes. I really puzzled over some of the statements of the confession that I was being asked to affirm. Do we want use of this confession to be restricted to those who are educated not only in theology but in older Englishes? I don't. I care about actual sheep, definite names of actual real-life people who desperately need the doctrine in the confession. My heart beats for Tyndale's plowboy, not just in the area of Bible translation, but in the area of teaching. Revising the confession in an official way does not mean dumbing down or dishonoring the work of the Westminster divines. It rather honors them because it carries their purposes into an ensuing generation. I almost said the next generation, but it's not the next. There have been many generations intervening. Surely it is those purposes of the divines that matter more than the precise syllables that they chose. But it will take big names, trusted names, and big institutions, trusted institutions, men leading various constituencies in schools and denominations, like I said, to do this work. And so from my tiny little spot on the Reformed spectrum as an independent, I'm not even part of a Reformed denomination. My church is independent, and I've been independent since I was born. I'm issuing this call. I think Reformed denominations should hold a sort of ecumenical council and translate the confession. Not revise it, translate it. Also, I think this ecumenical council should serve ice cream and meet not in rainy old England, but in Westminster, Hawaii. I predict that debates over the meaning of the confession will increase in difficulty over time as our English moves further away from that of the Westminster divines. How are we supposed to decide if something is of the essence or of the circumstances of worship if we don't know what the latter word even means? Adjudicating the meaning of the confession will become even more the province of specialists, of Protestant canon lawyers, as it were, violating the Reformation spirit that gave birth to this document, the belief in the priesthood of all believers. I also predict that if you try to translate the confession, you will discover a number of phrases that, though you may have read them countless times, you nonetheless cannot really place into modern English without expert help. In other words, you will find that you yourself, whoever you are out there in YouTube land, don't understand the confession as well as you had previously assumed. That was definitely my experience. What is the determinate counsel of God, for example? Are you sure you know? Ask a smart friend. What are the supplies of the Spirit? If you want the confession to last, and I do, you should translate it. Otherwise, here's what's going to happen, what has already happened. And I told you these reflections would be indulgently long. Reformed Christians who want to catechize their children and teach their congregations are going to turn to other sources, like Tim Keller's excellent New City Catechism, which I have myself used with my own children. I don't have any institutional pressure on me as an independent to stick with Westminster or London Baptist. My personal allegiance is more to Crossway than it is to Westminster. And though I felt the pull of using traditional language when catechizing my own children, much as I did when I wrote my vows and used basically the traditional ones, I feel a greater pull from 1 Corinthians 14 as a dad, which tells me that edification requires intelligibility. I was not going to spend hours and hours teaching my kids words they couldn't understand when words they could understand were readily available in a nice app on my phone. I was not going to have my children repeating want of conformity unto when they could say lack of conformity with It's difficult, I know, for people who have come to love the Puritans and other older writers of illegally long sentences to think of shortening those sentences without doing violence to the intellectual satisfactions found in working very hard through those sentences. They believe in the perseverance of the saints. True Christians will put in the work to understand the Puritans. And I don't wish to take away that joy from people or that challenge from anyone who wants it. I think people will be reading the Puritans in their original Greek for centuries hence. But at the risk of being a bit confusing, read Marilyn Robinson. This is a contemporary writer I appreciate, whose prose is clear but demanding, whose sentences are a little longer than average, I think, but still nowhere near the length and abstruseness, the complexity of so many early modern English sentences. Marilyn Robinson, by the way, is also substantially to my left, except when she isn't. She has written stalwart defenses of the God of the Old Testament and of the morality of the Old Testament that I commend to you. What I'm saying is that sentence length is no sure sign of intelligence. Shorter sentences aren't necessarily dumber than longer ones. I read a whole book on this matter by John McWhorter, that great linguist, and I'm still not totally sure I can explain all the cultural reasons why longer sentences and formal, flowery verbiage have fallen out of fashion over time in the English-speaking world. Presidents don't use oratory anymore. They just kind of shoot the breeze. But I do regard this as a matter of fashion, of choosing the appropriate fork, and not as a matter of morality or of intellect. Bad writers with nothing to say can write long sentences. Good writers with fantastic depth of insight and beautiful prose can write short ones. And the modern ear is tuned to the latter, not the former. English today demands shorter sentences. That's why every translation of the Confession into modern English that I personally have seen breaks up many, many of the long sentences of the Confession. I want to camp out here for just one more minute. I told you, indulgently long, because love for the Puritans, a love I share, ought to be first of all a love for their faithful wedding of Christian head and Christian heart. And yet, it sometimes gets transferred to their prose, as if there was something holy about the culture of English letters back then. A long, long time ago, I used to find myself arguing with people who say that English has degraded since the 17th century. But I just don't buy it. We read today the 17th century writings that have risen to the top, the Puritans, Milton, Shakespeare, Bunyan. I won't even deny that these names deserve our reverence. But there were terrible writers of blasphemous and pornographic works in that day too, like the infamous poem that I found online that you should not look up called The Choice of Valentines. I can't print the full title, and yet it was written in the final decade of the 1500s. I wish I didn't even know about it, to be honest. And these works, blasphemous, pornographic ones, used the same, to us, lengthy and, to us, overly formal English prose. So there were morally bad writers back then, and just as today, there were just bad writers back then, people who didn't write good prose, people who really shouldn't have been allowed access to pens because they Englished so bad. Thankfully, their works have fallen out of print. The bad writers of today just haven't been winnowed out by time yet. And we have good writers today, great writers, universe-class writers, clever writers, deep writers, demanding writers, smooth writers, all of whom write in our English, not that of the 17th century. I'm just not willing to say that Berkhoff is better than Frame because Berkhoff is harder than Frame. No, I've always taken it as a sign of John Frame's brilliance, that he's able to write such amazingly simple prose and yet communicate such profound theological truth. I say the same of his friend Vern Poythress. I run their website. I hold tradition as a value. I like Puritans. I enjoy puzzling out the meaning of a naughty Owen sentence. But when I stood on the platform in the gym at my Christian school in a play my senior year, and when the lights suddenly went dim as I, playing William Tyndale in that play, was strangled to death before being burnt in front of hundreds of my friends and family, something in the fake flames lit a spark in my heart. I want people to understand the Bible. I want them to understand sound doctrine. And I appeal to Augustine, a master of rhetoric. What use is a golden key if it doesn't unlock the door of understanding? And why disdain to use a wooden one if it does the job? Isn't our goal understanding? Why did God give teachers, if not to leave to them some responsibility to judge how best to get the truth across to Christ's sheep? Translate the Confession.